basketball team. He is the #1 social status at school. Gabriella is a transfer student, but she's incredibly smart, and she joins the Scholastic Decathlon team. And so she's kind of like a nerd. You could call her a nerd. That's kind of her clique at school, whereas Troy is a jock. But these two individuals step outside of their cliques, outside of their social statuses and their norms, their circles, to audition for the school's spring musical, their high school musical, hence the name of the film. And this causes a whole bunch of stuff to happen, which is, the whole entire point of the film. But it challenges the ideas of these high school juniors of what is my place in this school? And am I stuck in this one little niche, this one little clique? And in fact, shortly after their audition becomes public knowledge, there's this really kind of awesome scene, the song in the cafeteria called Stick to the Status Quo. And this song is all about how there is this status quo, this norm in high school and in everyday life, but we're talking about high school right now. And so every single chorus of this song has an individual saying, hey, friends of mine who are in this particular circle, I have a secret that I need to share. And the friends are like, oh, absolutely, tell us all about it. Don't keep that stuff to yourself. And then they share something that is against the status quo, that is outside of what is expected of them. And then their friends immediately backtrack and say, no. You keep that to yourself. Stick to the status quo. And in fact, the chorus says every single time, if you want to be cool, follow one simple rule. Don't mess with the flow. Stick to the status quo. And so you get a basketball star who loves to bake, and he's told, no, you're a basketball player. You can't bake. There's another nerd, an academic student who loves to dance, and she's told, no. You're a student. You don't dance. You do your homework, you do the Scholastic Decathlon, the spelling bee, all that stuff, but you don't dance. There's a skater who likes to play cello, and they're like, no. Not at this school. You are a skater, you skate. If you want to play the cello, you should have been in band. Then you could have been a band. And so the whole point of this movie is that the status quo doesn't often work the way we think it should. It's often not a great thing because it sets us in a mindset that things are the way they are and they need to stay the way they are. And so my main point today is that following Jesus demands that we follow the example and teachings of Jesus, not the expectations of the status quo, the way that things are. And you see this all the time, especially in the New Testament, because the way that things were was not often good. And so Jesus challenges a lot of that through his teachings and his examples. So we're going to look at that today in our passages in Mark chapter 15. So we're going to start with Jesus on trial. We're continuing his trial from the previous chapter or two. He's about to be condemned and crucified. But before I actually read these verses, I really need to set the stage so you understand really what is happening and what is the norm that is being challenged here. Because when I say trial, even before I did this research for this sermon, I often would still get stuck in my head of a scene like this. I know it may be a little hard to see, but it's just a modern American courtroom. You have the prosecution, you have the defense, you have the judge, you have the jury, you have the audience, and all of these people have very particular roles, a way that things are. So in the modern trial, you have the prosecution who is suing or seeking damages from the defendant. They're an individual or a group, an organization represented by a lawyer, or as y'all say here in Texas, a lawyer. You have the defendant who is defending themselves through a lawyer or lawyer, however you want to say it. You have a jury which is comprised of 12 carefully chosen individuals. You get a jury of your peers, you get that phrase, if you've ever been called for jury duty, you go to the courthouse and they ask you a bunch of questions that make sure you are qualified to weigh in on this court case. You have a judge who has rigorous education and experience in law and its practice, and you have the audience that just kind of sits and watches in the back and can't make any noise lest they be kicked out. But that's a modern criminal trial. In first century Rome, it was very, very different. You still had the prosecution and you still had the defense, but there were no lawyers back then. They didn't have law school to attend. They were what were called advocates. And to our eyes, they would kind of be glorified actors. They could say and do pretty much anything to convince the jury that they were right. We'll come back to this in a second, but there was no burden of proof or proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It was just, hey, if I can convince you that I'm right, I win. You had the jury, which, based on my research, could be comprised of as many as 45 people. Probably men, because women didn't have as much social status back then. So could you imagine having 45 or 50 people trying to debate and decide what the verdict is? Our juries of 12 people often go hours to decide and weigh the evidence, and you're expecting a group 4 times that size to do that. Then you have the judge, who is any adult male with a basic education. In fact, we talked about this in Sunday school, but Samuel has more education than any first century judge probably did. So Samuel, do you feel confident that you could weigh in as a judge nowadays? No. But that's what they did. Just any adult male with a basic education and maybe a little bit of experience, maybe as an advocate, but you were just anybody. But then the audience, this is maybe the biggest difference. The audience could actively participate in so much as they could influence the jury however they wanted. I will come back to this in a second. But also, these criminal trials were also kind of an all-or-nothing grab for power. Whoever won was viewed as having high moral standing. Somebody who was maybe hard on crime, and maybe somebody who you really should support for a local office if there was an election, or just to give them your support and your money. And so it was really kind of a popularity contest. And so you could do anything. You could bribe and you can threaten. You can bribe or threaten any party involved. The audience, the jury, the judge. The advocates could summon any number of people to their side, which just inflates the audience to get some more people on your side. So for example, Jesus could have summoned all of his followers to his side. But you can also lie. You can insult people. I can say, for example, Lance has a receding hairline. Obviously, he's untrustworthy, and you should condemn him. And people are like, "No, it's right. He doesn't have hair." And so there's so many things that you could do because there really were no rules. These trials didn't happen very often because of, like I said, it's all or nothing. If you lost, you went down a rung or two in your social status. If you won, you went up. But because anybody could lie about you or insult you to your face, you never knew what anybody was going to say. And you can also just work people up into a frenzy, which we'll see later in this passage, and get them really angry or really excited or really upset. And if you could get to the crowd, the audience could then influence the jury, who would then make the final verdict that the judge then kind of has to follow. And so with all this in mind, this very public affair, anybody could show up, anybody could watch it, anybody could get involved and turn the table. Let's read and see what happens here. So Mark chapter 15, starting in verse 1. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, the whole Sanhedrin, made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they are accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. What I find most notable here, especially knowing how Roman trials work, is that Jesus could have played along. He could have summoned all of his followers. He could have given a moving speech like he did at the Sermon on the Mount. He could have pulled out those woes that he's already spoken from Matthew 23 to attack the Pharisees and say, "Y'all are being stupid." But he didn't do any of that because he knew that this was more of a popularity contest. He wasn't concerned with winning the trial. Yes, he had to go to the cross, but 100% certain that if he'd won the court case, they would have gotten to the cross eventually anyway. But what he does is he's not following the expectations. Because Pilate even calls him out. He's like, dude, they're throwing accusations at you left and right. And you have nothing to say in your defense? And Jesus is like, no. You want me to fight and prove that I'm better than you? No. Y'all are following the rules to do your own thing, but Jesus is defying those rules and setting a different kind of expectation, which he did a lot. For example, in the Sermon on the Mount, he has so many parts where he says, you have heard it said, the status quo has said, these religious leaders of this day have said, this thing is the rule, but I tell you, here's a different rule. Not just your behavior, but also your heart matters. He dined with prostitutes and tax collectors and was called out on it so many times. He spoke directly with women who had lower social status, especially the story of the Samaritan woman at the well. He never should have been there, never should have interacted with him, and his disciples even said so. But Jesus is setting a different standard because the standard that was there was wrong. And he literally touched lepers. People who had to walk around in rags, shouting unclean, so that people clear a path for them. He just literally walked up to them and touched them to heal them. So Jesus had a habit of defying the expectations that the contemporary, then, culture expected from him. But now let's talk about the Pharisees and this guy named Barabbas in verses 6 through 11. It says, now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Jesus asked Pilate. Knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. In spiritual terms, this event is often called the Paschal Pardon. And in my research, I found some arguments that suggested it likely didn't happen, but most of those boiled down to the fact that this tradition doesn't appear in any historical documents outside of the Gospels. But it's in all four Gospels, so I think pretty likely that it happened, because it's in all four of them. There aren't many other stories that are in all four Gospels. But to humor those critics, I also did, doing my research on the Roman courts, I think there are plenty of reasons why this pardon could have easily happened. So, in a Roman court, when you are convicted of a crime and declared guilty, your punishment follows immediately. Some people were saying that Pilate didn't have the authority to free a prisoner who was in prison for murder. But if Barabbas had been convicted of murder, he would have been put to death immediately. There's no going to prison for 20 years on death row waiting for your number to be drawn. If you are declared guilty of murder, you are killed as soon as possible. That's why Jesus, in just a few hours, is hanging on the cross. They're not rushing to get him dead before Passover or before the Sabbath. They're just following the rules. He's guilty. He deserves death. Let's kill him. Why wait there in the middle? And so both Barabbas and Jesus were waiting for their final trial, their final hearing, to decide whether they were guilty or innocent. And it turns out this ended up being both of theirs. So that's one reason that I think Paschal pardon easily could have happened. But what I also find interesting is that Jesus and Barabbas are kind of two different kinds of revolutionaries. And so in this situation, the religious and political authorities, being the chief priests, the Sanhedrin, and Pilate, are forced to choose which revolutionary they want. So you have Jesus, who was really against the Pharisees, didn't much care about Rome in particular. He was mostly interested in correcting the teaching and the culture that the Pharisees had taught. So he challenged them, and really he advocated for love and compassion over violence and murder. Compare that to Barabbas, who was directly against the Roman authority, And at least his friends were willing to murder for their cause. You can jump back a couple hours to the garden, and Peter cuts off a guard's ear, and Jesus is like, no, 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 no. Don't do that. That's not the way things are supposed to happen. And so in this moment, the Sanhedrin have a choice to make. They're the prosecution. They're trying to get Jesus condemned. And so they decide, we would rather have Barabbas, this anti-Roman revolutionary, than Jesus, this guy who's against us. Jesus is bullying me, so I want him dead. Barabbas is bothering you? I don't really care. And so this goes back to what is said in Mark 15:10. It was out of self-interest that the Pharisees brought Jesus to Pilate. Other translations say envy or resentment or spite. So, like a good Bible college student, I went to the Greek. And so the Greek word here is a little tricky because the starting sounds are, it's phthero. An F and a TH sound there. Phthero. It means to corrupt, to lead astray, to make unclean, or to destroy. This word is used of the temple. If the temple is ever made unclean by someone being unclean and coming in, or somebody who was led astray from the teachings of God. And so in perhaps one of the biggest, most ironic twists, the Sanhedrin, the chief priests, who are the top spiritual authority in first century Palestine, have been corrupted and led astray by their own interests. They don't want somebody challenging them. They don't care if you challenge Rome. But they were top dogs next to the Roman leaders. So if Rome got out of the way, it would be like heaven on earth for them. But even with Rome around, they were number one. So they couldn't have anybody challenging that. So what they were doing was they were growing accustomed to this status quo, to the way that things were with them on top, and they wanted to maintain that. They were willing to do anything. It worked out in our favor because Jesus died for our sins, but they were willing to do anything to maintain their position of political and spiritual authority in Palestine. So, let's talk about Pilate. In these last few verses, we're really kind of focusing on a little bit more on Pilate. So Jesus here is condemned. So Pilate asks, "What shall I do then with the one you call the King of the Jews?" "Crucify him," the crowd shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Then, wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So I'm going to wrap up a little bit later and kind of tie up all these loose ends. But again, we're coming back to the idea of a paschal pardon, where Barabbas is released and Jesus is condemned. And so some more evidence to suggest why this could have easily happened. Some people argue that Pilate had the backing of the entire Roman army, so why would he be afraid of what is a glorified mob of unarmed people shouting at him? But if you recall, these trials were very public occurrences, and the crowd was actively participating. So if you worked up the crowd, and the crowd worked up the jury, then you as the judge are maybe the only person thinking rationally. And what are you going to do? You're going to say, I know you said that Jesus is guilty and we should kill him, but what if I don't? My last point there is, Pilate likely would have caused an even greater insurrection. He would have had so much trouble on his hands because he would have directly opposed the Sanhedrin and the entire crowd and just completely upended the way a Roman trial works. But you can clearly see that the crowd is getting worked up here. Because he asks, "What do I do with him?" And they shout, "Crucify him." And then Pilate asks a simple question. He's like, "Why? What did he do to deserve this?" And they get louder. They get rowdier. They're getting worked up. The crowd is getting worked up. The jury's getting worked up. And everybody is about to throw hands if Pilate doesn't crucify this guy. And so Pilate does what probably any other Roman judge would do: release Barabbas crucify Jesus. It's what the crowd wanted. And so we get this verse here that says, wanting to satisfy the crowd. And I've kind of alluded to this. But some people look at this and think of Pilate as kind of a people-pleasing pushover. If somebody looks at him sternly enough, he's like, oh, sorry, I'll do whatever you say, sir. But he was the governor of the region. Really, nobody could tell him what to do except like Caesar in Rome. But he was just following the rules. The way that a Roman trial went said that whatever the people says goes. And so I find that incredibly tragic, honestly, for Pilate, because he did exactly what was expected of him. He followed the rules, even though it wasn't necessarily the right thing to do. It wasn't the moral thing to do, because this guy was innocent. It's never right to kill an innocent person. But Pilate's hands were tied. Either he does what the crowd wants and kills Jesus, or he doesn't, and they start an uprising, a revolution, and nobody wanted that. So, we're going to put it all together now. We're going to go back to our main points. We're going to go back to kind of the summaries of each of these main sections, and then we're going to wrap it up with some final thoughts. So my main point today was following Jesus demands that we follow the example and teachings of Jesus, not the expectations of the status quo, of the way that things are. And so we kind of have these 4 points, and we're going to include High School Musical in this, which I am. So we have Troy and Gabriella breaking out of their cliques to audition for the High School Musical. We have Jesus defying the norms of fighting tooth and nail to win a trial. We are the Pharisees who are stuck promoting their religious and their political agendas because they're on top and they want to stay there. And Pilate who obeys the law even though it's the wrong thing to do. So what does that mean for us? We find ourselves in, I would say, turbulent times. Things are crazy out here, and things are seemingly only getting crazier. But we have to be very, very careful about falling into a few select traps. We're going to talk about those. So first, we have to remember that we are fighting a spiritual battle against the devil, not a socio-political battle against any perceived human enemy. Ephesians chapter 6 says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, authorities, against the cosmic powers of this darkness, against evil spiritual forces in the heavens." And so we have to be very careful. Am I opposing this person, or am I opposing their choices, or the spirit that has deceived them, as we talk about in 2 Corinthians 4? In their case, the God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. And so Jesus knew this, so he didn't participate in the trial. He knew his enemies weren't actually the Pharisees. It wasn't actually Pilate. It is the devil. It is sin. And so he willingly gave up the trial so that he could pay for our sins. And so in a similar way, there we go. Put that, come back for a second. We should be very wary of how we interact with people and how we talk about people and think about people. Because we may not agree with the general choices of a people group, but our enemy is not that group. Our enemy is the devil that has deceived that group into thinking this way of living is okay. And it's a fine line. And there's a degree to which some of those groups and individuals will see your opposition as a personal attack. And that's on them. But our priority should be winning hearts and souls to God's kingdom, not elections for our chosen political parties. Because, I'm going to come back to this kind of in a minute, but changing the political party and changing the laws doesn't change people's hearts. We talk all the time about being not about behavior modification, but about like true, lasting life change. But then we get caught up in the status quo of fighting for this political power to change the laws as if that is actually going to change people's hearts and make them follow Jesus. So we can't have any more of this Republican versus Democrat, white versus black, straight versus gay, man versus woman, American versus immigrant, any of that stuff. We cannot be so vehemently opposed to a people group that we lose sight of the fact that we are fighting against the devil and his spiritual deception on these people. So the things that you do, the things that you say, the things that you share on social media, and even the ways that you pray, I encourage you, as I almost walk forward off the stage, remember that you are praying against the devil and his influence on these people. That should be our ultimate goal. Second, we need to stop being so obsessed with our rights and our political agendas. That's kind of what the Pharisees were doing. We have this phrase that we should be in the world, but not of the world. And it comes from these verses in John chapter 17, where Jesus says, I'm not praying that you, God, would take my disciples out of the world, that you protect them from the evil one. They're not of the world, just as I am not of the world. So how can we expect to be in the world, but not of the world, when all we do is play the same games as everyone else in the world? The Pharisees were all about maintaining their political authority. And the same is true for every political party nowadays. All they want to do is keep the power. All they want to do is change the rules to fit their agenda. And then we jump in and we play the exact same game. We say, you do this, you can't do that, I'm making that illegal. And then we wonder why people don't want to hear the gospel. When we're condemning them for doing something and we're doing the exact same thing. We end up talking about life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Like, one, those are the end goals of life. They're not following Jesus is. But also, like, those are things that are found in following a particular political agenda. Those are things that are found in Christ. And changing the rules is not going to change that. We get so caught up during, for example, the month of June for condemning the LGBT community for their pride hats and their shirts and their flags and their rallies. But then July 4th comes around and we do the exact same thing. Our American flag hats and our American flags and our t-shirts and our Make America Great Again, or Trump 2024. We're playing the exact same game. And we wonder why people don't want to listen to us. The devil is better at this game. He's been doing it way longer. And that's why Jesus doesn't follow the status quo. He does something different. John chapter 15, verse 13 says this. It says, no one has greater love than this, to lay down his life for his friends. And I mentioned that we need to be less obsessed with our rights, our political agendas. And I kind of talked about this briefly with Samuel and Braden in Sunday school. But Jesus literally gave up his life for us. Why are we so unwilling to even consider the possibility of giving up something as trivial as even like gathering in a public forum like this, or owning a gun? I personally don't care about owning a gun. I enjoy coming to church, but if you look all around the world, there are underground churches that are thriving, despite it being illegal technically for them to gather, because they're still gathering. They're willing to lay down their rights and their lives for the sake of the kingdom. But we here in America get so caught up in my freedoms, my rights, that we're just not playing the same game. And so lastly, we need to be more concerned with changing the hearts of people, not changing the law. 1 Corinthians We need to ask ourselves, am I fighting a spiritual battle against the devil? Or am I fighting a political battle against people? Am I fighting for my own self-interest? For the rules that I want to be in place? For my rights and my freedoms? Or am I fighting for the kingdom? And are the causes that I support, are the people that I support, are the laws that I want passed, and the way I want things changing the hearts of people? Or am I just trying to change the rules to make people act the way I want? So now we're going to read the verses. With all this in mind, we're going to read the verses, and I'll pray, and we're going to close. But I want to be as crystal clear as I can. I am, again, not saying you can't support this candidate or that candidate or this cause or that cause. Just be very, very, very careful that you're not playing the same games that everybody else is, that you're trying to change the rules as if that's going to change people's hearts. Vote for whoever you want. Give your money to whatever organizations you want. I trust the Holy Spirit in all of you. But I see a lot of stuff on social media and in the news about the church playing the same old games. And it's just not going to work.